Hi, I'm Paul Lister, and welcome to Agile Keys, a podcast about Scrum, Agile, everything in between, and everything on the edges. Hi everyone. The last couple of podcasts we've looked at agility and Scrum and obtained definitions of those. What we're going to do this time is a little bit different. I'm going to have a conversation with Gary Lane. Me and Gary worked for 20 years on both waterfall and agility. And Gary went through a transformation and went from being a team leader to a Scrum Master. So we're going to talk about that history and some of Gary's thoughts and feelings that he had at the time, with the hope that maybe this will be useful for new Scrum Masters. So let's listen to this conversation. So hi, this is hopefully a regular slot in the podcast where I talk to Scrum Masters and Agile coaches about their experiences with Scrum and agility, both past and present. Today I'm going to be talking to Gary Lane, somebody I worked with for a long time. Hello, Gary.
Hello, everyone.
We work together both in a agile and non-agile way, and we're going to kind of talk about that. We're going to kind of talk about our experiences in that vein. So if I can start with you, Gaz,
Yes,
what was before you went through an agile transformation? What sort of work were you doing, and how were you doing it?
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks for inviting me along, Paul. My pre-agile background, I was very much in software development. Initially as a business analyst, stroke tester, as it were, and I sort of graduated, if you like, into becoming a development team leader with line management duties. Very much accountable, if you like, for the output that the teams were producing and how long they were taking to do it. And I often found myself playing Tetris with Microsoft project plans to try and fit tasks into
The evil Gantt chart.
Yes.
Talk about that for a minute, just because I certainly remember how painful that was. Talk about how we used to do that as a group.
Yeah, so well, we used to have a sort of lead time for a project for a release that was, well, probably ranging between 1 to 2 years normally, and it was basically gathering requirements up front from a lot of different sources for a lot of different things that weren't necessarily related, but we needed them all up front so that we could have accurate estimates applied to them. And then we used to put each individual task on a Microsoft project plan that would then indicate perhaps when we were going to finish. This is all very waterfall, I should say, if you hadn't guessed already, everyone. And you press the magic button and say, well, it's gonna happen a year next Tuesday, and then. And then you might get the initial feedback that said, yeah, but it needs to be done in 9 months, you know. So and then you sort of try and, as you say, sort of unpick it and put it back together again to try and bring that date in without even thinking about what might change over.
I seem to remember we used to take a long time working on estimates, normally from requirements, and then working on estimates to the point where we're almost solutioning them in order to get that estimate right.
Very much so.
And then being challenged if that, like you say, if it was any length of time that seemed to go past some sort of contracted date, then we'd be challenged on it. But the upfront time that we spent on that seemed to be a lot and very challenging, and then we ended up having to cut it in half anyway.
You did really, and you know, with hindsight, I look back on that period and think, well, what value did I add at that point in those initial estimating phases and requirements phases, and what value did the teams I was working with add in that? And I think the answer is next to nothing, really.
Well, it's very much a kind of factory system, wasn't it? Because I was actually a software developer on Gary's team to start with, and then I became stupidly a team leader myself. but it was very much as a team leader, it's very much a factory system. You farmed out estimates
Yeah.
in the team, or you'd receive estimates and then you'd farm out that work to resources. There was no real discussion about who should do what.
Mm.
Is that your memory of it, Gaz?
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Absolutely. You're sort of making assumptions on that plan. Well, uh, if someone of a normal level of experience, like a developer or a tester, would be able to do this in 2 days, but it's not factoring in any sort of skill sets that you've already got on the team, or whether you're lacking anything. It's
Yeah, and it was such a pressure cooker, but
yeah,
it didn't really take that into account. We had a lot of new people joining, graduates who didn't last very long simply because they were allocated work whether
yeah.
they liked it or not.
Yeah, and you know what? I think one of the things I found was, although you try and help your teams as much as you can, you find that you're antagonising them as well, because I'm sort of having to ask them every day or something, how long is left on this now.
Yeah,
Not because I want to ask them necessarily, because they understand the work far better than I do. And of course, we didn't have any sort of daily scrum like mechanisms where we're all connecting, seeing where we're going wrong and what have you. It was literally me going around asking everyone individually, which you think is madness now, really, when
yeah.
you think of where we got to.
Well, it was very
Um,
much project management when we think
yeah, it
we had
was.
project managers. It was very much going around, getting status updates, marking stuff down, seeing if the Gantt chart changed, etc., etc. And there was remember there was a kind of fixation with timesheets.
Yeah,
Job
absolutely. Yeah,
codes.
it was the tool really that sort of it felt that sort of management were using to sort of see how development were doing really, and that was the way that they track their costs as well. I think, which is and I appreciate you need to do that somehow, but it's sort of I think in the end it wasn't just about that. It was about tracking individuals, I think, really, and it
Yeah, it
just
was definitely.
didn't show the whole picture, did it? Really? And I think I think I never meant to antagonise anyone by asking them these status updates, but some people would immediately, take that as, well, why do you keep asking me? And I
Yeah.
sort of understand why they asked that question. Really. It was, as I say, you feel you actually feel actually, am I adding value to this process as a team leader, or am I actually just making it worse?
Well,
So
the whole job code thing really didn't. It ended up getting gamed by both the individuals and us as team leaders,
yeah,
just to avoid grief. We used to
yeah,
shuffle um,
yeah, very
hours
much so.
around like there was no tomorrow. So it doesn't. Even if you have that system in place, it doesn't mean it's an accurate reflection of what's going on necessarily.
Mm, mm. And I think also what it showed working in that sort of environment and methodology is that we we weren't all as an organisation joined up, because one project manager might come to me to ask about progress of one thing, and then another one might come along and say, I've got this thing coming along, we need to squeeze this in. But those project managers wouldn't even be talking to each other about, you know, what are these things equal in value, or is one more important than the other, and whatever. So it's sort of there was no product management, there was no product ownership in that waterfall system that we had. Really, it was very much go to the development team leader and get
Yeah,
them to
well,
sort it out.
that's a good point actually. It did feel like the whole top down system,
Mm.
the whole nodes, that person tells this person to do it, and tells maybe a high manager would tell a project manager to do it. They would have a go at department head. They would have a go at the team leaders. Team
Mm.
leaders have a go at. But I seem to remember there's very little breathing room for developers to ever talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You sort of find they're the last to find out, I think, and I think that's probably one of the things that sort of would antagonise some of them, really, because, well, hold on a minute, you're telling me now.
I should probably make it clear without out that naming and shaming the particular companies involved. But this was very much a kind of a financial software company. So it's mostly when we talk about developers, we don't mean Scrum developers. We do actually mean coders in this particular case. as well as testers and business analysts.
And to be honest, Paul, I think once you're out in the wider community talking to Scrum Masters who've been in a similar position to us in the past, we've heard similar stories. Really, I don't think it's uncommon at all. Actually, these problems that sort of perhaps the waterfall methodology in a bigger organisation, how they manifest themselves. Really, I think.
Let's talk about some of those problems, because if we can talk about kind of the upfront documentation and
Mhm.
how that was supposed to improve the value of the outcome. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I think my experience of that is that you would go through quite a detailed process of gathering requirements. I think from our point of view, my experience is that we'd have consultants that weren't on the development team writing these requirements. And that would probably start by either talking to other people in the business or the customers themselves, but not always the customers. I thought, which is quite interesting. I think, um, and um, and then they put together these requirement documents, and I've seen some 4 pages long. I've seen some 150 pages long.
Yeah,
That require estimation.
I wrote one that was 150 pages.
Yes. And so, first of all, you sort of go through that whole process of reviewing and understanding the requirement. That's the stakeholders, the person who wrote it, the development team, and manage certain level of management as well. Only when the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and everyone's happy and it's signed off, can you sort of move on to the next phase, which would be, as you mentioned earlier, an estimation phase, which you have to do a bit of the solutioning, and you've got a document like that to actually come up with any sort of numbers. And of course, it's not, as we know now, we're not taking the most valuable bit from that requirement, if you like, and saying let's go focus on that. We're talking about the whole 150 pages, and it's only
Yeah,
when
that
we've
that
done.
was. I think
Yeah,
that was the problem. Was
yeah,
you we you don't want a solution, but
no,
you have to if you're talking about an enhancement of a certain scale of complexity, and you're being forced to give a what is the right number, then you're going to do some sort of solution in order to break that down. And that was kind of unavoidable with that system if you're talking about months of work
yeah,
instead of a couple of weeks of work.
yeah.
What so in terms of we do a lot of upfront documentation, we do requirements and business specs and tech specs. And there was a kind of an illusion of control there, but what was our kind of in your experience of QAT after?
Yeah, so sort of as you say, went through specking, coding, and testing phase from the development team, and then, well, actually, it would be, let's say it was one enhancement A. Quite often, would enhancements A to Z, you'd wait for them to finish together for a release QAT, and it would go back to the consultants, potentially those that wrote the requirements, sometimes not, for them to do their own form of testing. And what you found was, despite you sort of trying to match up each bit of code that you've tested with a B spec part which matched to a requirement, you find they'd say, actually, this isn't fit for purpose. And you
I
think, well,
used
hold
to
on a
hate
minute.
that when this phrase first come in,
Yeah,
defect in requirement,
defect in requirement.
and,
Yeah,
normally it was the person raising that who had written the requirement.
yes,
But
that's
but, it's,
right.
that's not a surprise. In retrospect, that's now not a surprise.
It really isn't. I mean, I've had a lot of these things we're talking about, Paul. You think, how naive were we?
Well, yeah,
Working in that, all of us working in that way, because very much we saw things like that. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, I think some of the requirements weren't even ran past the customers themselves that
yeah,
this is eventually going. Some of them were speculative. And so, if the consultant testing it thinks, actually, I didn't think it was going to work like this, then what did the customer think? And quite
yeah.
often that did happen, really. So,
I always think when I'm doing the CSM courses, I kind of talk about that and talk about it's like a kid with toys at Christmas.
yeah,
If you just describe the toy to the kid, he's not going to care. If you show the toy to the kid, he might get a little bit excited, but he's not going to know whether they're going to like it or not until the kid actually plays with it. Then they're going to know it's what they wanted.
And of course, knowing what we know now, that's exactly what should be happening. So yeah.
Okay, that was kind of your your life before Agile, so to speak.
Mm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how you got introduced to agility?
Yeah. Firstly, very badly. I think, and that what I mean by that is that you start to hear the word bandied around, and it's not even in the thought process of your management team or anything like that. But you just hear individuals saying, "We need to be more agile," but when you question them about it, and of course you haven't at this point, I haven't done any reading or research or anything into it. You think, well, what does that mean? And you don't get an answer. I mean, and to the other extreme, I've heard people say, well, agile is well, you just do what you want, isn't
Do what you want other.
it? So it was a very, very loose introduction, I think. I don't, is it somewhere in between the two? I've got no idea at this point in time. So, but I think then, as you know, Paul, we were transformed, if you like. We had a new management team come in, didn't we? And they very much had agility in mind. They brought in coaches, Scrum coaches, Agile coaches, Lean coaches, whatever, plus some with XP experience as well. I think for the developers and whatever. And then it was a very full on, wasn't it? Very full on sort of training exercise, if you like. With, of course, a 6 month trial period, I think, for a couple of Scrum teams, I seem to remember, wasn't it? But yeah, we were actually bombarded with information. We really were. I mean, I've got, I'm not being critical at this stage of those coaches, but I'm just saying we got so much information. I think we didn't know how to pick it apart. We didn't know what was Scrum, what was XP, what was Lean.
Yeah, that's the problem I had with really, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being critical as long as
Yeah,
as long as you learn something from it.
yeah,
I mean, certainly what I learned from that when I started coaching and teaching was to differentiate between these things. What are these things?
yeah,
What do they mean? To the point of even explaining in courses now, I explain what the Agile Manifesto is and which bits of Scrum fit into it and which bits of Scrum don't fit into it that well.
yeah, yeah,
And that was a problem we had. You're right. We did just have. I think we thought everything was Scrum.
yeah,
Because it felt like we were sort of taught you're doing this next, then you're doing this in a kind of chronological event way.
yeah.
But we never had it explained to us in any way that differentiated these different things, like you said, like Lean and Scrum in
Mm,
particular, those
mm.
ideas.
I think even if that's partly true, I think we had just so much information in a short space of time. I think it was hard to process it all quickly in your head about that, really. And it might be a question you got in a minute, Paul. But when you think about what you would do differently, I know you did this, and I wish I had really was
Mm.
actually sort of take that information, take the Scrum Guide, take the manifesto, the Agile principles, deconstruct them, put
Yeah.
them back together in a way that you understand, I think, or is it clearer to you anyway, really, I think.
Yeah, I always thought about if I have to explain this to somebody else.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
That's the main reason I did a lot of that stuff. And like you say, deconstruct is right. How do I really understand it? Because there's a big difference between, and you'll see it now with even with coaches, a different big difference between being able to quote something from a source and being able to explain something from a source.
Mm.
They're two very different things, and you normally see that very quickly when people say, "Well, what does that mean?" And they go, "Well, it doesn't matter what you mean. You just have to do it."
And I suffered from that, Paul. I think, one of the biggest problems I found, because, for our listeners, as it were, I was then thrust into a Scrum Master role, having done some intensive training, but had no experience, and I you know, hadn't done this deconstruction. I was still trying to learn what the terms meant, what was in
Yeah,
the Scrum Guide. And as you say, if running a Scrum team with developers who were new to it as well, and a product owner who was new to it, I might get asked a question, and because I was a Scrum Master, I think I was expected to know it, and
yeah,
I probably tried to come up with a quick answer that was, well, you have to do it this way because that's what that says, without saying why are we doing this. And I suffered from that, definitely.
I in the early days, because I did exactly the same thing,
Yeah.
because I was as wise as you at that point, and I did the same thing, and I was very much saying, right, I know how the event should be run. It tells me in the Scrum guide. I'll run them like this. But as
Yeah.
soon as anyone questioned anything, I
Mm.
didn't really have.
The tools in your, yeah.
Yeah, I had no way of easily explaining well why it's of value. It's an easy thing now because we're sort of a bit more agilist and a bit older and a bit wiser.
Mm. Mm.
I've just noticed there's a fly in my coffee. A bit older and a bit wiser.
I
Still,
hope it's not one of those joke ones,
I'm still I'm still going to drink it. Um,
man.
um, the it is important to understand the value of something, the why of something,
Yeah,
rather than
yeah,
just the what. I think.
absolutely. And I think, if I was in that situation again and someone asked me something like that, I think I'd just say, I'll be honest, I'm not too sure at the moment, but let me work on it. Let's try and. I think I'd spend more time saying, learning techniques for the teams to help themselves to find out a better way forward. I think I say, well, you have to think about that amongst you. Try and agree the best way forward to try now, and if it don't work, try it again. Rather than saying you have to do it this way or whatever. And then I'd go and try and process that information of what I'd observed and listened, and then see how I could help them later. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that in a new Scrum team like that. Really, it's
How did you handle? Because there's something that I had problems with in the early days, and not just how did you handle, but what comment have you got on it? The fact that we were told to be agile and told to do scrums, and not everybody in teams particularly perhaps wanted to do that. So what was your opinion on that kind of mode of transformation, and also how did you deal with people who perhaps weren't as enthusiastic about the framework as others?
yeah, that's a really good question, and I think the initial answer is very badly. But I think initially I'd put my old team leader hat on. I think in the early days and sort of try and have a word with those people individually.
Well, the kind of one-to-one thing.
Yeah, that sort of thing, really. Just to sort of say, oh, what's your problem, and how can we, how can we help? What would be better for you? That sort of thing. But I think it was soon I learned really that it's best that they get those problems out and they're open with the people that they're actually working with
Mm.
every minute of every day, rather than just a scrum master who isn't a team leader, in the traditional sense. So I think it is sort of trying to craft, if you like, your retrospectives to sort of bring out those problems. So either that person would bring it up, um, or the rest of the team might bring it up if they've noticed there's something in particular with this person who's not too keen on the change, as it were, really, and sort of discuss it in the open a bit more. I think it wasn't easy, and if someone's dead against something, and no matter what anyone says, they don't want to do it. They don't want to do it. It's tough, but it's
I definitely had the similar problems in that vein. I think the trick is to start with exactly as we've been talking about. I tried to understand the why of the thing,
yeah,
but even that sometimes didn't kind of pierce that cynicism about
no,
it.
no, no,
But if you could, my way of dealing with it was if trying to find a way for the individual involved to gain value themselves.
yeah, yeah. It's a great way of thinking.
Things like if you're a developer and we make smaller things, then you're going to get less defects back.
Mm,
And because we know that wasn't a fun game with people raising defects all the time,
mm.
and it was trying to find something for them that's of value, not just the intrinsic value that you eventually learn when you're not just saying what you have to do.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it, Paul. Actually, probably another example is a very experienced developer who could probably knock something out in 10 seconds, whereas a new developer, it might take them a couple of days. Now, quite often that might frustrate the sort of senior developer, if you like, and sort of say, I'll just do it, and then sort of say, okay, so how are you adding value to the new developer? You know, how do they learn all
Yeah.
that? You have to do this when you're not here. It's those sort of bringing those sort of things out. Yeah, it's really
It's working.
good,
It's
good way
trying
of
to
saying
get
it.
that group think across instead of
Yeah,
individual think, because I think teams, especially in things like software, tend people tend to be insular, and perhaps the whole remote working thing makes that a lot more apparent now. But trying to get your point about not reverting to team leadership and doing one-to-ones with people,
yeah,
trying to get them deal that in retrospectives is a really important one. I think trying to get that group thing started, and I think that's the problem with with coaching full stop in transformations is
yeah,
if it's not done well, and especially if you've made a kind of a project manager into a product owner and a team leader into a scrum master,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
if that's not done well, people will. It's just human nature to revert to what they
Revert
know.
back.
So
Absolutely,
they'll just do the thing they know, and I think we did that a little bit in the
we
early
did
days.
definitely. Yeah, yeah. Mm.
So we've talked about some of the agile transformation stuff. Is there anything else with regards to that agile transformation you wanted to mention?
Let me see. I made a few notes here. Yeah. Do you know what I think the problems are not just that you have as a new Scrum Master, for example, not just with the team and the cynicism and stuff like that, and what have it, or the wider organisation. I think, you know, that from a personal perspective, there was probably a lot of anxiety to start with. You know, I was thrust into a role I didn't know I could do. I didn't fully know what it was because of the reasons we've already talked about. A lot of information, and therefore I did feel a bit of anxiety sort of shifting between a sort of managerial role to a more coachy type role. So what I found really helped, and I know you did this a lot more than I did, Paul. Really, is get yourself out in the wider community. I
Mm.
think that what the wider Agile or Scrum community, I think whether that's going to conferences, just sort of listening to podcasts or going to meetups, you
Yeah.
know, I think it did wonders for my self confidence. Because sometimes at those things you're thrust into slightly uncomfortable situations where you might have to role play or act on something like that, you know. But generally, when I sort of look back on when I did those things, although I had the dread when I started, I actually thought, hey, that was really good fun. You know, that was great. And do you know what? No one ate me. No one attacked me. You know, we were all trying to help each other. And
Yes, it's a good point actually. I think one of the most confusing things at the time, and it doesn't say it in the Scrum Guide now because it says true leader, even though they list everything as services when it comes to the accountabilities of Scrum Master, was that whole idea of a servant leader.
yeah,
Because we didn't work in a company with that kind of thinking. It was very much you are a manager and
yeah,
you are telling people what to do. That servant leadership took a while to kind of get my head around, and it was going to conferences and meetups and
mm, mm,
looking externally um, to things that starts giving you that idea that what you're trying to do is get them to find ways to find the path, not tell them what the path is. But
yeah.
there's such a subtlety in that when you're fresh to it, but it's really worth trying to find other sources to investigate because
It,
you can't magically do it yourself.
you can't. And you know what? When you get out there, you find a lot of other people have the same problems or slightly different. And you'll you'll introduce a problem. It will get debated, and you might get a few ideas. You can come back and use them. And then what you find yourself doing, this is when you know it's working, is that you go to these things and then you start helping other people with their problems. And you think, hold on a minute, I must be getting it now because I could actually contribute to that discussion, you know. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, I feel good. If that person tries that tomorrow, that's brilliant. I've doesn't matter if they who they work for, you know. There was didn't really have a concept of you're a competitor when you go to these things. It's
Yeah, yeah, that
more,
was the
it's a
difference.
community rather than a competitive thing, really. It's
Okay. So is there anything I think we've sort of touched on this idea a little bit already, but was there anything that you wish you knew then that you know now when you were
Ooh, yeah.
in the midst of that transformation?
I think, sort of touching on what I said earlier, I think I would say I would tell myself it's okay not to know everything
Mm.
now.
Yeah.
And and you find a path. You need to sort of be thinking in an agile way to find that path. What is it? Whether you've deconstructed the Scrum Guide or the Agile Principles and Manifesto, which isn't a bad thing to do, and think, well, how can I help teams more with that bit, or that bit, and think, how am I adding value, or what do I need to know to add value
Mm.
to say for the team to say, oh, simplicity is key. If they're overcomplicating something, what can I do to help them with that? It's but don't try too hard.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
That's really struck a chord with me actually, because I
Yeah,
think again I think it bounces back a little bit to if you don't know how to do it, do what you know.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I was very much even the stuff I knew tend to be from the Scrum Guide. The stuff I didn't know, I still made up answers as if I did know it,
mm,
and I
mm.
didn't know it.
Yeah. No, that's right.
I should have turned around and just said, "Well, I don't know," and like you say, perhaps talk with the team about. Well,
Yeah,
let's talk about those ideas. That sort of bled on a little bit, and I think you noticed it because you've trained with me before. That when in the early days of training, it kind of carried on that type of feeling, which was we must execute the training properly.
yeah,
And
yeah,
if it goes off piste, you start going, how do we get them back
yeah. That's it.
how do we get them back in line? Whereas now it's very much different to that. It's very much, is there something we can learn together from this exercise or piece of training veering off
Mm,
away from the original concept?
yeah,
I think that's really good advice for a fledgling Scrum Master, I think.
yeah, and you know, so don't try and over talk. As I say, do a lot of listening and observation. And I think you're absolutely right. I think if you're trying to veer something back on the right track, maybe in the initial days, don't try too hard. Just let it go off track, and then get them to say at the end, "Okay, how do we think that went, everyone?" And immediately you've got some retro stuff that you can think, right, okay, so this. In the Scrum Guide, it's 3 hours for this, but you've spent 5. So,
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's a problem with the effective word in the
yeah,
Scrum Guide. The effective word kind of implies they better be good.
yeah,
They better do well. But there's other perspectives on that word effective. You could say, yeah, they better be good and they better do well, but that might take 6 months, that might
yeah,
take a year.
yeah,
How do I employ coaching techniques to get to there? Not how do I push them here?
yeah,
And that I think that's a problem with the subtlety of some of these words within the Scrum Guide is saying things like that. But you're exactly right, and kind of I've kind of done the converse of that with teams, which is when they're bringing too much in
yeah,
all the time, is just turn around and go, we'll bring one thing in.
yeah.
If they're constantly not hitting their sprint goals, we'll just bring one thing in, and then you'll normally see product owners throwing all their papers up. I go, well, no, they can bring another thing in after. They just have to finish that thing. So
Yeah,
getting the confidence, not really learning velocity, but getting the confidence to start finishing stuff before.
yeah.
You
I
know,
think that's
I,
very
I,
important.
where I'm going to go off piste a little bit here, but the one of the phrases I hate is stretch sprint,
Yeah,
stretch goal, stretch sprint,
yeah,
any of that stuff. It just means you're putting too much stuff in,
it is. Yeah.
and you're going to context switch. You're going to go all over the place. It's bane of my life.
No, agreed, mate. That's a great technique actually to take from anyone really. Any new Scrum Master is make that suggestion. Just think, keep it very simple. What's the next most important thing? Small thing. Just do that. Just focus on that, everyone.
So you started working as a Scrum Master as after the transformation. I was working as Scrum Master as well. Was there what were the things that you thought? you were doing really well after a few months, and what were things that you felt you never really got the hang of?
Okay, right. I think I got on a bit of a roll with retrospectives. I think I was getting quite good at and quite creative with them.
Mm.
And again, I think this is helped by being in a wider community, including your good self, really sharing ideas on things like that, and sort of see what people talk about. I think there was a talk at the Scrum gathering in London.
Oh yeah.
A whole, you know, 2.5 hours on retrospectives. I mean, you know, it's all that sort of getting some ideas really. One, to inject a bit of fun in it, but two, sort of to try and, you know, eke out problems that you thought were there really. But I think when you're doing something new and where people have to concentrate to understand what the rules of the game are, if you like, in order to do these retros, immediately I think they switch on more. Um, if you're just doing, okay, what went well, what didn't go well, you know, what can we do different every time, and some people will just sit there and go, well, we finished it, we didn't finish it, we could finish it next time. That's, you know, they can get a bit blasé about it.
I kind of like we sort of switched it in the early days in the what's in your control and what's not in your control.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it was because of that whole complacency thing of just going, oh, it's a retro, and I don't want to have to talk about this and that. And we were finding, because I remember me and you talking about it very much, unless we divided it down into things like individual, team, and organisational,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah,
then we weren't getting any individual impediments and barely any team ones. It was always something wrong outside the team all the time
mm,
that they didn't want to improve. The gamifying thing is it's a dangerous game.
yeah, yeah.
I
Go on.
remember doing one where I was trying to still do the retro and still look at the problems we had, but I felt like the team wasn't talking very well, and I I kind of it was a swing and a miss. This one I did speed dating.
Ah, yes. Now I did try that myself once, based on your
Yeah,
experience. Yeah,
I think again with some teams, I think this is knowing the culture and personalities of your team. I think
yeah.
some teams that work really well, and when I say speed dating, I don't mean literally they were taking each other to dinner. They were literally just it was like musical chairs. They were talking to one team member about what they felt went well, what didn't went well. You know, what would they like to change? And then they'd all swap and talk. So you get this big subjective point of view, and maybe generate some actions out of it. And some teams love that sort of thing. Some teams absolutely hated it. And
Yeah.
it's understanding the culture and the behaviour of your team, which takes a long time, I think.
It does. It does. But I mean, I think I love that one when I did it. Actually, I think one of my favourite ones I actually did, Paul, was, and this is back in the day where we weren't remote. We were in an office. I basically had a big poster of an Amazon product, and the product was the increment in
There you
that
go.
sprint. And you know, I got people to do a description of it, to do ratings and reviews of it, and stuff like that. And there was with a price next to it. I was like, well, what value are you getting out of that product owners? I found that. I mean, when I introduced it, I think a lot of people looked at me and just went, "What are you on?" How long did it take you to put all this together?
Yeah.
But when they started doing it, I think they found it quite fun, and
I think
you
when it
did get
works,
some good actions out of it.
I think when it works, it's great and it's generic enough that you can do it. I think there is a danger in putting too much work into
There
stuff
it
and
is,
then
yeah,
persisting with it. My and you'll know about this, but for people who are watching this, as an early CST, I was running a certified Scrum Master course that was pirate themed. And the some of the analogous stuff were just wasn't close enough to what it was trying to explain in terms of Scrum. But I put so much work into it, I wouldn't let it go for a long time. It was literally, you know, they I can't remember who the quote was by, but when it comes to like writing, you should kill your children. It was one of those.
yeah.
But if you put too much work into it, there's a danger of not
There is.
deleting it. It's one of the things I talk about when I'm talking about product backlogs in courses. is the fact that one of the very good reasons for not writing a product backlog item like a long-winded specification is because then people don't want to delete it out the backlog if they don't need it anymore. And you end up with these great big bloated backlogs simply because people don't want to delete stuff. There's another reason why they should be kept small.
But yeah, so I think that's one of the things that I felt that I was getting quite good at.
Hmm.
I'll tell you, there's one thing I don't think I really mastered, and that's working in a big organisation. I think is sort of company-wide stakeholder management. I think that's something I would say I struggle with. All right for sort of individual teams and the stakeholders for the sprints that they were working on, etc., like that. But trying to get the wider organisation to engage in, say, sprint reviews, for example, um, I found very, very difficult. And even actually, when you had stakeholders that were working closely with the team, sometimes when that product increment was ready, you found that no one was using it for another 3 months, and you think,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah, there's a big frustration with that, with defects coming back after they didn't
yeah,
integrate until a few months later. I remember that.
yeah, and I never really sort of managed to get deep enough into the organisation to work that out. But with hindsight, I'm looking back on it, and I think this was similar in a smaller company that we started with, Agile, is that all of training was on the development team and the product owner. There was no real training on the
And the
stakeholders.
outside, yeah.
So they didn't fully understand what we were doing, and what they were doing didn't really fit in to how we were doing it, and whatever. And I think once we got our company was consumed into a larger organisation, that was just multiplied by 100. If you see what I mean, I think.
Yeah, let's move on to that then.
Mm,
Let's move
mm,
away from agile transformations and the old days as Scrum Masters. So so you've sort of started talking about how agility and Scrum in particular works in large
yeah.
organizations. How have you found those implementations post working in a smaller company?
So I think the great thing when our smaller company was consumed into a larger one is that we were allowed to carry on doing what we were doing and evolve and develop that. And it's great. And I think because we had fantastic transparency where we were, and we started filling the walls around us with colourful propaganda posters,
Yeah,
scrum boards,
I seem to
whatever
remember we
physical.
upset a lot of people doing that.
I think we might have upset a lot of people who like nice, clean and tidy offices rather than ones with post-it notes everywhere. But I loved all that, and what I found is that I suppose, okay, there were perhaps sort of, what do you call it, sort of property maintenance people who weren't too keen on it and whatever. But it piqued interest in others that were working in also in software development on different products who would wander through the office and sort of have a look. So what's all that about then? Really started a conversation. So I think my initial experience of the wider organisation was great. They're looking at what we're doing. They're talking to us about it. And of course, we had our communities of practice days where we could start to explore in more detail some of those things that they might have noticed and asked questions about in a bit more detail and get them more interested. And Paul, I think when we first started doing that, I think other people working on other products we sort of we weren't told. It wasn't a management thing. It was like, okay, well, what can we help you with to try to change the way you're working to make it slightly better, one bit at a time. And I think the key was not using the agile words. If you see what I mean, it's just you've talked about how can you add value to this, that, and the other in little bits, and I think that's what it's all about, really. If you can do that without actually using the agile words, get people working in a different way that they're pleased with, then I think you can look at the wider transformation. I think
It
it's
seems to
it.
be
Yeah, go on,
a
mate.
trigger for some people.
Yeah,
I hesitate to say it because we're not exactly young, but it does seem to be older people who it seems to be a trigger for in some shape or form, or have been in the industry for quite a long time. and without really understanding exactly what it is, just don't want to engage with it because they know what they know already and they
Yeah,
don't want
yeah,
to change things.
yeah.
But I kind of understand why, and you've touched on a couple of these things. I think is the fact that really things like Scrum aren't designed for big
No,
organisations.
no.
They're not, and what big organisations tend to do is try to crowbar it inside development, and that's where you start getting your stakeholder problem because
Yeah,
they've got other people who deal with
exactly.
stakeholders, and suddenly you've got these nodes to deal with, and Scrum's not designed to deal with it. It's designed to bring them in. And I seem to remember you were very successful with having stakeholders interact with Scrum teams after a period of time, but after actually coming in and doing things like show and tells and stuff like that. Can you
Yeah,
talk about that
absolutely.
for a minute?
Yeah, no, it was sort of quite a it wasn't a concept that I think sort of perhaps people at a management level were too comfortable with to start with. I think, which was actually having the people that have built the product try and understand what the sprint goals and the product goals were, and build products around that. To actually directly show them to our customers. Normally it went through like it did in those waterfall days. Someone doing system testing and a QAT, and it might have some other form of testing at the other end. But no, say, well, actually, we finished development. Customer A, come in, we'll show you what we've done. Is this what you were expecting? Really, anything else we can do? What do you want
The,
next?
the kid at Christmas principle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was really, really successful. I think the customer could actually see that they were getting value
Mm.
for the money they were spending, not waiting a year or so to get it all at once and find out it's something that wasn't going to meet their purposes. So I felt that they they could see that they were getting bits of value all the time, all the way through the process. And do you know what? Scary as it was, I do remember one occasion we said to the customer, I'm afraid we haven't got anything of value for you this spring. It just hasn't worked for whatever reason, and it was a lot of people saying, oh, who's going to deliver that message? And it was a difficult one, but you know what? It's an honest one, and I think the customer actually appreciated it.
Well, when we think of the Scrum values, courage,
Yeah, yeah,
openness. Straight away you're starting to see some of those coming into play straight away. And I think the problem is that values have been beaten to death so much by companies misusing them and not caring about them really, and just putting a picture of people in a boat saying teamwork underneath it, not actually doing anything about it. But yeah, that sort of stuff certainly tends to engage. And people, I remember you did it in particular, and we did it to a limited extent. But people were saying, yeah, but it's not Scrum, is it? Because you're supposed to show it to them in the sprint review. And I said, but it is Agile because there's lots of pieces of Agile, like XP, for instance,
yeah,
where you
yeah.
prototype stuff and then you show it to a stakeholder and then you go in different directions. And it was that misunderstanding again of firstly, you must follow a rule book,
Yeah.
which in fairness, that's what Scrum says. You must follow the rule book, but also not understanding that there's other bits of Agile that you can utilize
Yeah.
within Scrum teams.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, but I think generally with the organisation, and going back to the people that, as you say, when we're talking about using agile words or not using agile words, those people were us. In the early days. So I do have a lot of sympathy for those people. But I think when you get to a larger organisation, I think if it's a sort of say people are brought in to do a transformation that's across a few thousand people, for example, you get into framework thinking, and I think
Yeah.
they'll impose a framework, expect everyone to follow it and understand it, and one framework may not be appropriate for everyone.
This is what's important about the why of the thing, though. Like, for instance, an organization who decides to do scaled Scrum, but then they have a product line across multiple departments where the people on the Scrum team were only in the Scrum team for 50% of the time. All this stuff that Scrum says not to do, have a cohesive team, have it working on the single product line. That's their only focus. They don't understand the why of that. and they also really probably don't understand the what most of the time.
Mm.
Like you said, framework thinking in their heads, a lot of the time, Scrum is a group of events.
Yeah, yeah. Mm.
It's a group of events that you follow, and all the other stuff's probably the same in between. They don't think about the values, the theory, and the why of the events. The why they're there. So it is a very good point. But like I say, and you've been with me on transformations. You don't go in and say you're doing Scrum now. You go in
No,
and say what you're doing well, what aren't you doing well.
yeah,
Then you try and find something. If Agile can help them with the things they're not doing well or improve the things they are, then that's the thing to go. And I think that's the mistake that a lot of organizations make, is just say we're doing this framework or that framework now,
yeah. Mm.
and then just try and
I completely agree, mate. I mean, and again, out in the wider community, I think we've sort of discussed that. It's really common. It's really common. The people that we've spoken to about these things, they are problems that we try and use agile to overcome. And I think we had quite a lot of success as well, really, with it. And people do generally engage, but it is difficult. The whole organisation thing as a Scrum Master, servant, if you like, to the team and the product owner and the organisation. That's the bit we all find the hardest.
yeah.
The bigger the organisation, the harder it's going to be. It's simple as that, really. It's I think.
Well, it is like I say, it's crowbarring, and sometimes it means that certain roles won't exist or become hybrid in some way,
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah,
and I don't think organisations want to accept that. They, like I say, just want to plunge Scrum into a development thing rather than a DevOps type shape.
yeah. Mm.
Let's change tack a little bit, because we've talked about your experiences early on as a Scrum Master and transformations. We talked about organisations a little bit. Let's talk about the wider world of Agile and what you think about various organisations or certifications within Agile. Have you got any opinions on that?
Um, yeah, certifications. I mean, my path obviously didn't extend quite as much as yours did, mate. I mean, you're obviously probably a better place to talk
Yeah,
about it than me.
tread carefully.
Yeah, than me. But I mean, and for that reason, that's great. If you want to be a CSD, you want to be a certified Scrum trainer, you have to do it. You've got a long and dedicated path to follow. I think, as you well know. Uh, I mean, there are, okay. Let's take the Scrum Alliance for example, and Scrum.org. They're probably the best known ones. There are plenty of other ones out there, I'm sure. There's plenty of scaled ones as well for the people interested in that sort of thing. What I would say about them is, even if you're not on the path like you were, I think actually, if it's a training course where you're there or you're in a group of people remotely, but you're all interacting, again, displaying some sort of courage in an uncomfortable situation, training environment, it does wonders for your self confidence. And you'll get something out of it. You'll get more knowledge out of it, really, than say just doing a multiple choice e-learning type thing,
Yep.
really. And to me, doing the certifications that I did, which I say for me, I only got to the advanced Scrum Master level, but even that I think I had a fantastic couple of days. I really enjoyed that. We did that together, didn't we? When we were, I seem to remember we were drawing pictures to try and illustrate a point about Scrum or agility.
Yeah.
I can't quite remember what it was now. And one thing I remember about that is that I put my hand up first to do it, and I never used to do that.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I said, right, I'll present mine. And then actually, as I was presenting my picture, there was something in my head that said, actually, rather than me tell you what it is, what do you think it
What
is?
do you think? Yeah.
Because I was getting some feedback for what I'd done, and I thought about it afterwards and thought, I have learned something. I have learned how to do that.
I think
And I
that's the
think,
value
yeah,
without going into the kind of the organisation wars.
yeah,
The kind of the value of the Scrum Alliance is they do make you spend time with coaches to get
yeah,
certifications,
yeah,
and it is that I think that's in that absolutely invaluable. Is as long as those coaches have come up through the system and done the job themselves, I have a lot of Scrum Master experience and anecdotal tales about to
Yeah.
reinforce points, but also because we've both been on both sides of that fence, the waterfall and the agile side of the fence. You can sympathise with people who
Yeah.
are still having trouble with understanding the value of such a transformation.
Yeah.
But without that interaction, like you say, you are just doing a multiple choice test with a
Yeah.
bit of self learning.
Yeah.
And then to go from there to being a scrum master in a job, using that, we both know that's troublesome.
Mm. I think the other point as well I'd make about that, as I say, there are so many things out there, but let's say you're skeptical about something. I say there's quite a few scale frameworks now, aren't there? And maybe you, from what you've read or practiced, you like one more than the look of another, and you think, well, actually, if you did a certification for the one you're not so sure about, you're far best placed to challenge it. Really,
Mm.
right? If you've actually been taught it and what have you, I think so. There's that way of thinking about it as well. I think maybe
No names, no pack drill. Sometimes I
no.
can just look at a diagram from framework and I think, no, thank you.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good kind of try before you buy
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
type of thing. Yeah, that's not a bad way of thinking about that at all. Um, I think I mean, actually, maybe you could speak to it a little bit because me and you both interviewed Scrum Masters for quite a while.
Yes, yeah.
And what was the relative value of qualifications against, say, experienced that you found when we were interviewing?
Um, Actually, can you just reword that? Sorry, could you just
Yeah, of
restate that
course. Yeah.
question?
So
Yeah,
so when we were interviewing,
yeah,
we were getting people in probably with PSMs or CSMs.
yeah, yeah. Okay,
But how much value was actually having those qualifications compared to the experience
that's
that they
okay.
portrayed to us?
Right, gotcha now. That's a really good question because I think there were plenty of people I interviewed with the same qualification. Let's say it was CSM, um, um, and you might interview someone who you think, well, they're way past CSM. They're probably at least ACSM or whatever. And there are some you think, how did you get that qualification? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, which again, I guess it's the feeling of that qualification rather than the pressing the buttons to do the exam. If you see what I mean, I think you can tell just some people really understood it, and some people had just learnt it to pass an exam. I think, and therefore, if I saw it on a CV, I wouldn't go, "Well, that's great." Oh, I would say it's great. Well done, you've got a qualification. But it wouldn't suggest to me that's good enough to become a Scrum Master for the role that I was interviewing for. I think.
Yeah, I think we found because we sort of surprisingly uh, inspected and adapted while we were doing these interviews, and
Yeah.
two of the things. I think one thing I brought in and the other thing you brought in. The thing I brought in was just describe Scrum to us in 10 minutes
Yes. Yeah.
because we were surprised how many people couldn't do that, and yet they had things like professional Scrum Master and certified Scrum Master qualifications, and yet they couldn't explain to us how Scrum works. Some of them with alleged experience. And the thing you brought in, which I really like, was the board, was the well, I don't want to say Scrum board, Kanban board used as a Scrum board, but a Scrum
Yeah.
board.
Yeah.
Do you want to describe that briefly?
Yeah. So, sort of putting it in context, I think COVID-19 obviously put us in a remote world, and my feeling was that we'd gone from nice physical boards, if you like, that we talked about earlier, nice colourful post-it notes everywhere, which really were transparent to see how things were going. I think we struggled to do that with the tools that we were using in a remote world because visually they're just not as pleasing, I think, and easy to follow. They do a great job for other things, these tools. But I think we needed to find a better way to visualise the work, and therefore we were using virtual whiteboards to try and visualise the work as if we were back in the office. So the context there is that for an interview, I sort of actually put one of those virtual whiteboards together with sort of a list of product backlog items down one side, and the columns, as you say, the Kanban to do, in progress, done on the right, and just put various things, various columns with people's avatars on what they were working on and what have you, with a little sprint goal at the top. Lots of tasks for those backlog items. And I sort of, in my head, come up with, let's create a few things that a Scrum Master might notice that perhaps sort of slightly odd or worth challenging. And I presented that to our Scrum Master candidates to see if they would spot those things, or just actually get their opinion on it. And it was quite a real eye-opening exercise, actually.
I think a lot of the time it tended to show us that they hadn't had an experience. Occasionally, what it showed us was that they didn't really have the qualification, but they could spot problems within the Scrum team.
Yeah, it works both ways. Yes. Yeah.
Which I'll actually put that on the note. When I do the podcast notes, I'll put that board on the podcast notes so you guys can see it. Okay, that's an interesting little chat about certifications and you making me feel bad about being a CST. Okay, let's start summing up, because it's been a great chat. But if you could give one piece of advice to a new Scrum Master, and don't be a Scrum Master, a new Scrum Master, what would it be?
Right, if it's one piece of advice, okay. All the things we've said, I think I would say get out in the wider community. I think that's so important.
Yeah.
It's great. I know we all work, I worked for an organisation. We all work for organisations we have a lot of affinity with. They pay our wages, do the work, pays a lot of other wages. We get friends from these organisations. But you know what? I think for a Scrum Master, I think you need to talk to other Scrum Masters that aren't in the situation.
Yeah, that sense of community. The thing you said earlier about not having to pretend you know everything and not feel bad about not knowing anything. Once you start to realise there's other people in the same situation, then that's great. That's a really good piece of advice. I'd say learn lean.
Yes, well, that's a great one. That's interesting. We were taught that first, actually, weren't we, with our transformation? Yeah, it's a good point.
We just weren't told it was lean.
Yeah.
Okay, Gary, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for inviting me, Paul.
And hopefully your experience will help out other people in similar situations.
I hope so too, mate. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheerio.
If you like this podcast, please show that by liking and subscribing to it. My social media details will also be on the podcast notes. I'm always happy to talk about agility. Remember to keep responding to changes, and I hope to talk to you soon.